We'll be placing a YouTube version of this up on our YouTube channel for those of you who want to see it again later, and also for anyone who couldn't make it to the session today. So just so you're aware of that. Let's see, what else before we get started? Yeah, for the people who've been there before, usually I have lived my way through this stuff and I tend to get ramble a little bit. But this time I'm going to try to be a little bit more disciplined because we have a lot to cover and there's a lot of people here, more than normal, or at least might be more than normal. So I'm going to actually be reading sections, not the whole thing, but important sections from the extended write-up. So if you have it on your computer, you can follow along, or if you don't have it, you can also download it directly from the website. It's about 20-something odd pages. I'm going to be reading the whole thing, but parts of it just to keep myself from rambling. But I'll be pausing throughout after certain sections to allow people to react to the stuff. Anyway, another thing is that we're not going to be discussing, for any of those of you who may have strong opinions about any of the current existing wars, we'll be making references to real wars and maybe even some of the ones that are going on now. But this isn't about so much who's right or who's wrong, but about the wars that we will be citing or mentioning will be illustrations of some of the concepts or ideas that the topic is about, which is about just war theory. Basically what that is, and we'll be digging into it much more later, but basically it's an attempt to civilize war, if that makes any sense. But that's roughly what they're trying, just war theory is trying to do. So, okay. And I think I'll get started now. Okay, I'm going to briefly list in sort of a rough outline of where I'm going to go with the presentation, and then I'll actually start reading and then pausing and discuss, and then we can discuss. Roughly, this is the outline of the discussion. First, I'm going to start out with telling a little story about Bertrand Russell, who was an important philosopher in the 20th century, and who lived long enough to live through both world wars and some of the wars after and between, and was an important philosopher. I don't think he was a particularly great philosopher, but he was certainly well known for, probably more well known as an activist, a political activist, than to the general public than for his actual philosophy. But he had some interesting things to say about this topic, and also he reacted. And what's interesting about him, I think, is because he was all over the map on war, and to see how real life historical events can twist a person's views about this is interesting. I think it's sort of just a preliminary story. We're not going to be discussing Russell's views in great detail, but he's an interesting story. Then I'm going to pass on to do a brief description of what just war theory is. We'll have to come back to it and some questions around it just to introduce the idea. And then I'm going to back up and do some history of the concept of just war up to Aquinas. This is kind of important because this is an old topic, and it's kind of interesting to understand where we are today, to see where these ideas came from. And they do have a long history. Bits and pieces of them will show up even now, even ideas that were around before the Greeks, before in 400 BC, for example. And I'll be just providing highlights from that history. There is a great article about it. It's linked to in the write-up if you want to pursue it. And it's very well written, by the way. It's by Rory something. Anyway, I'll mention it when I get there. And then I'm going to talk about, after the historical part, some contemporary living philosophers right now, a handful of them, are saying about just war theory, and how they're basically starting to deconstruct it and say that it's really incoherent. It makes no sense at all if you start asking hard questions about it. And then we'll go into a deeper dive to get to some of the details. And some of those might be kind of controversial. So that's where I hope the discussion starts with. And then we'll see where we go after that. Anyway, so to get back to the beginning, I'm going to start with that little story from Bertrand Russell. I paraphrased his position there in quotation marks. He didn't actually say that, but when you listen to his story, it sounds like he just does sum his position up well. I call it make peace by all means necessary, including war. Okay, he didn't say that in so many words, but well, here's the story. After the First World War, he favored the pacifist notion that we should try to cordially accommodate a formidable civilized enemy to the point of capitulation to avoid the horrors of war. He actually wrote a letter, which has been preserved at a museum in Los Angeles, which has struck people. It said I'm not won't read the letter, but you can find it, a link to it. But basically suggested something like this. We should wine and dine Hitler, this is during the 30s, and make territorial concessions. He was writing to the Churchill and the British government at the time. This is before the actual war started in the 1930s, but the people could see where things were headed at the time. He basically said we should wine and dine Hitler, make territorial concessions, if at all possible, to the end of getting him to see the advantages of acquiring Britain intact and not in post-war shambles. Russell was always against atavistic national pride. He thought it should not get in the way of reasoning our way to survival. Then, too, he thought Germany could listen to reason. They would benefit from not having their own cities bombed to smithereens. And he spoke of something called a civilized war. Is one where one side agrees to win and the other side agrees to lose with minimal fuss in the interest of saving the reputation of the species as rational and humane. And if at least the enemy was from the same, quote, civilized part of the world as Europe and some parts of Asia, this is Russell saying this, that might happen, he thought. He really thought that basically he was very Eurocentric. He wasn't nationalistic in the sense that he was all pro-Britain or anything, quite the opposite. He was, for his time, kind of a cosmopolitan who thought that national boundaries were really overrated and that we shouldn't be, killing vast numbers of people to protect our national boundaries. We should negotiate and even give up to the enemy something of what they want, just to say, in return for which we won't bomb your cities either. So we'll just make a deal. That was his view in the 1960s. It was a kind of a pacifist view. He was heavily criticized at the time, but that was his position. And I should make clear that throughout his whole career, he lived a long time into his 90s. He was actually although his position on war was all over the map, as we'll see in a moment, his underlying motivation was pretty steady, and that is what he wanted to preserve was human civilization, not this or that country or this or that way of life, but human civilization. And if that means fighting a war, great. If that means suing for peace or surrendering, great. He was, as I said, by all means necessary. He thought that's what we should be doing. But this led him into some strange positions that, as we'll see in a moment. So this is before World War II and after World War I. Another aspect of Russell was that he wasn't, as I said, cosmopolitan, but he wasn't nationalistic, but he definitely was Eurocentric. His view of the world was that Europe was civilized, and when European nations fight each other, they should fight each other like civilized people, not barbarically, like people from who aren't civilized. And he had in mind parts of the world that he thought Europe rightly fought wars against in order to do them a favor of civilizing them. And he meant specifically places like the Americas, India, and in fact, he defended both Spain and Britain having basically conquered the Americas and Britain's empire over which the sun never sets. As long as the civilized people were doing the conquering and making things better for the rest of the world, including the uncivilized people, he was okay with that. He called them under-civilized people. Okay, so leaving that aside, uh, something happened though. As the Second World War progressed, he and many others began to see that Germany was going to lose, but Russia or the Soviet Union was beginning to become the future threat, not Germany, especially as the war was winding down. And then the nuclear bombs by the United States on Japan changed the game, so to speak. Now he became, for a while, super anti-nuclear. He was famous, probably still is famous for his anti-nuclear stance and his work to uh, diminish nuclear proliferation. But interestingly enough, this was 1944, right after the US bombing of Japan. For about a 5-year window between 44 and 49, there was only one country in the world that had nuclear weapons, that was the US. And Russell thought, that's how it needs to stay. We can't let these weapons proliferate so that everybody has them. Okay. Well, that lasted for a short time. By 1949, the Russians or the Soviets exploded their bomb. And now, wait a minute, in that window period, Russell about-faced on his views on war. He actually advocated strongly preventative war, that we should attack, the Allies should attack Soviet Union, completely conquer them so they don't develop a nuclear weapon, which he saw was going to happen. So he was all in favor of, preemptive war. Take care of the Soviets now while we still can, because they're not yet a nuclear power. So it was, again, his ultimate goal was saving civilization, not necessarily anti-war. And so he created this new position called, which is kind of contradictory, called non-absolute pacifism, which means, I guess you're a pacifist when you're not actually fighting a war. But that was his position. And again, it was motivated by curtailing nuclear proliferation. And then the Russians did get the bomb. And now he went the complete 180 degrees opposite. Now that the Russians had the bomb, the only hope he saw was for everybody to have a bomb. So it was all pro-nuclear. Everybody should have an atomic bomb. Why? Because he thought the logic of it would be that if everybody had a nuke in their back pocket, then nobody would dare start a war again. That was the new mantra that he took to heart. Anyway, so that's where so his new position after 1949 was coexistence by whatever means necessary, which means it could be the best way to coexist is for everybody to be armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, so that nobody would dare, try to rock the boat, because it would be the end of us all. And he thought that that would be a motivation that would prevent people from fighting wars if they all knew that they all had nuclear weapons, at least the civilized countries, that is. And he made a distinction there. So anyway, so what was his position all along? It was really about, as he pretty much clearly said, it was about preserving human civilization, not this or that country. And he thought he had great faith in human civilization and faith that people were fundamentally humane and could be talked into being rational if only, some people tried hard enough, So to sum up Russell, he may have lived too long and saw too many wars to have any coherent war policy. The kindest thing, this is me talking now, I think that can be said about his views on this topic is that he tried to learn from history, but did he? I think not. He assumed humans are fundamentally rational and above all humane. Perhaps he mistook this for the aspiration that one day they might be, if only they could survive long enough. Anyway, that's Russell. I just think it's an interesting kind of like a philosopher blowing in the winds of history, being pushed this way and that way and this. So getting more specifically to the topic now, justifying war is a philosophical problem because justification is a moral concept and war is a mass killing concept. We're going to try to wrap our minds around the conceptual gymnastics of trying to join them together, because it does seem rather hard to do.
Oh, we got a question, Victor.
Go ahead.
Victor,
yeah.
So where did you derive that justification is moral concept? Where did you get that? Just
Well, in
curious.
the history of philosophy, it probably goes back all the way to Plato in the Republic. Remember, actually, I'm going to be talking about the history in a moment. But basically, it's Plato in the Republic, and the opening lines, opening passages of that book, 300, 400 BC or something. He has a character named Thrasymachus who embodies the whole dialogue is about asking the question, what is justice? That's the topic of the whole of his most ambitious dialogue. At the beginning, he starts out by having people asking them, okay, tell me what you think justice is. And the first answer he gets is from an important, powerful Athenian leader named Thrasymachus, who basically says, justice is what the powerful can make the less powerful do. Basically, that's might is right. That's the background against which Plato spent the whole rest of the dialogue trying to argue against, because he didn't think that was quite right. But
that my question is, I don't think justification is necessarily a moral concept. I think it's used that way, but I'm just offering that, that's all. So I was taken aback by that because there is epistemic justification in which we construe things to be knowledge. There is rationalization, like we do justification in the court of law, right? Saying I did this because of this, and therefore I should or should not be held accountable. So I think in the world of morality, which is already getting kicked in the ass, so to speak, it's like justification and morality just didn't go together with me. Like, don't go together.
Okay, good. Well, there are other kinds of any area that I've talked about normativity in the past, which is basically there are three major areas of normativity as far as I can make them out. One is logic, the other is aesthetics, and the other is morality. Where there's justification within those. In logic, are you making a valid, rational argument? If you can give a very clear argument with premises and conclusions that don't violate any laws of logic and your premises are true, then you have a valid, or better yet, sound argument. And that's considered the ultimate justification in reasoning too. So that's justification in reasoning. There's justification in although there's a okay, well, yeah, there's different kinds of justification, but
I never just used it as a moral concept, and I just don't put justification as a moral concept. It's a means to an end. That's it. So I'm done. Thank you.
okay, all right. Yeah, well, we'll have a chance to talk about that more in a bit, but I did not the one who invented just war, and people use that other than me use that phrase. So apparently some people think there is a place or a role for justice in conflict, in violent conflict between people in war. There's such a thing as unjust war and just war. People talk that way, and we're going to be taking a close look at that in a moment. But thanks, Mary. So now I'm going to very quickly go through what just war is, or what the idea is supposed to be. And we're going to have to come back in greater detail in a moment to find when we start looking at the flaws in this argument. But it does, at first glance, it does seem like a reasonable thing. Just war theory attempts, as I said earlier, to civilize war. For war to be just, the core of the theory, owing to Thomas Aquinas, and he's probably the philosopher most associated with this idea in the Middle Ages, though he's been he didn't pull these ideas out of the blue, and people since him have contributed to them. But there are 5 parts of the classical just war theory. The first one is that a war is just if it's done for just cause, and we'll ask all kinds of questions about these in a moment. But let me list them first. For just cause, number 1. 2, it has to be necessary, as opposed to like just doing it for the hell of it or whatever. 3, it has to be legitimately authorized, not by some kind of authority, government. In the early days, it would have been God or whatever. It has to be proportionate. You don't kill 100 of theirs if they kill one of yours. That's a very rough idea of what proportionality means. And discriminate, meaning just war is seen that there are combatants, there are people that you're allowed to kill, to destroy, and others on the opposing side that you're not allowed to kill or shouldn't kill. The innocent, children, the sick, the ill, people who care for them, and so on. So these 5 elements, there has to be for a good reason, it's got to be necessary, there has to be legitimately authorized, it should be proportionate somehow to the harm, to some harm that's some threat, and there should be some discrimination. You just go around killing everyone on the other side. They're not, at least according to just war theory, they're not all equally to be feared or even guilty or of whatever it is that there is justifying you going to war against that. Contemporary philosopher of the subject, Helen Frowe, kind of fills it out what just war is here. She says, on the traditional accounts of jus ad bellum, which is the Latin phrase for the justice of going to war, of getting involved in a war in the first place, there's another concept called jus in bello, which is the justice of once you're in war, what can you do? What is it okay to do? So there's the distinction between the justice of going to war plus what you're allowed to do once you're in war. So she says, on traditional accounts of jus ad bellum, a war is just if and only if it has a just cause, is a last resort for securing that just cause, is proportionate to that just cause, is waged in order to secure that just cause, is waged by a legitimate authority, fought for the right intention, and has a reasonable prospect of success. In the other part, the jus in bello, fighting what's just within a war, the standard account of that is that of jus in bello, or justice in war, is a requirement that to discriminate between the legitimate and illegitimate targets and to cause only harm that is necessary for securing and proportionate to a military advantage. Okay, now each of those 5 things I listed has all kinds of questions and problems with it. First one, just cause. Who decides what is just cause? Is it you, your enemy, God? If it's some invested authority who decides, who invests them? 2, necessity. What fixes the necessity? What's on the table and off the table in negotiations? Do you have to defend yourself? Is preemptive surrender an option, as Bertrand Russell suggested it ought to be, if you're rational? Or is preferring death over the loss of liberty rational, as a la Patrick Henry, the American patriot, said, give me liberty or give me death? 3, authority. Does the legal authority of a state trump the moral responsibility of an individual? Can the state decide what is moral? Can the state tell you to do something that, if you decided to do it, would be murder? Do you have to listen to the country that you're a part of on these moral matters? Now, legally, of course, they can pass all kinds of laws. They can make you do things. They can lock you up. They can even execute you. But that doesn't make them moral. There's a legal versus a moral distinction, which most philosophers accept. For proportionality, and this goes up against human nature. Since when have human passions under extreme duress been constrained by the calculation implied in acting proportionate to a stimulus? In other words, when parties go to war, they know, unless they were born yesterday, that proportionality will be thrown out the window very fast. As soon as someone starts shooting at you, are you going to be careful if they wounded you, to wound them in exactly the same place? Or is it going to be, if they kill one of yours, you're going to kill 100 of theirs? And that's what typically happens. Finally, discrimination. Exactly who are the guilty we may destroy and the innocent we should not try to? Is it combatants who forfeit their right to live because they're fighting against you, and non-combatants on their side, do they retain their right to live? And if so, why? It turns out that's going to be a serious problem with just war theory in a moment. So I'm going to skip a little bit. Okay, so I want to be discussing basically 3 claims. By the way, I'm going to go through this section, and I'm going to go through the historical section, and then I'm going to pause, and we could talk about that before we get deeper into the problem, into the just war theory and all its issues. So we're basically going to be discussing three claims. the claim that just war is incoherent, that it makes no rational sense. Two, that, yeah, of course, war has an explanation, but that's not a justification. What's the difference? The fact that war may have an explanation sometimes obscures the fact that its permanent lack of justification. An explanation is like what scientists do or historians do, or what you do when you're trying to look for why something is happening, why you're ill, for example, you're looking for the bug or germ, or why you're getting sick, or why something is broken, your computer's not working, you want to find out what's making it that way and fix it. An explanation is basically a story you tell about that it organizes what you're experiencing. And so if you want to know why war happens, evolutionary biologists have that answer a long time ago, because we all want to survive, or we want our gene pool to survive. That's why they happen. But that's not in a justification. Again, this is how it relates to Mary's question about moral justification, because the justification is saying it's not only that this is how it happens, but it's wrong or it's right that it's happening. That a claim that there's wrongness and rightness involved is you're asking for a justification, either one way or the other, as opposed to an explanation. But maybe war doesn't have any kind of justification. It has plenty of explanations, but no justification. But that's one of the questions we'll be dealing with. Finally, if just war is pointless, because it's rationally pointless, where is it, for example? Or could there be some other reason why it's a good idea to talk about justice and war in the same sentence, other than the fact that they really fit together? It could be maybe there is no justification for war, but it still might be a good idea to talk about it. It could be performing some other function that it has nothing to do with justice at all. That's a possibility too. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit through this. You guys can read the great detail, but I want to jump to the history of just war theory, because there's a lot of interesting stuff here that maybe people don't realize has been around for a long time. But one of those, we'll start with Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian. He was a retired general and actually witnessed a lot of inter-Greek fighting during his life, and he's considered by many great historians to be a great historian, because first of all, he knew what he was talking about, and second, he strove really hard to tell it like it is. He wasn't especially interested in saying this group of people were evil and those were not. He was in the best tradition of historians trying to tell the story the way it really happened, as opposed to giving it a slant. Whether that's possible or not, we can argue about. But anyway, he articulated an idea which we already mentioned briefly, but he was, as far as we know, the first one in the Western world to say it. He said, I quote, "The standard of justice depends on the power to compel, and that, in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept." This is like that might makes right idea from Thucydides, I'm sorry, from Thrasymachus in Plato, except Thucydides wasn't saying and necessarily endorsing this. He was just saying, look around, that's how it works. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't necessarily promote the idea that might is right, but if you look at history, that's what happens. Later, as I mentioned earlier, Plato in the Republic does entertain someone who does say, not only is that described reality or history, it ought to be that way. It's correct for the strong to make the weak do what they want them to do. And so the just side in any war is the one who wins, basically, just in virtue of winning. That was Thucydides. Then Plato himself comes along, not that long later, much long later. He makes an interesting distinction, which is still there even today. Basically, he makes it in fighting war. It's permissible to be merciless toward foreign enemies, but we must exercise moderation in disciplining our own fellow Greeks. He was referring to the Peloponnesian Wars, where the Greeks were fighting each other, but they occasionally had to fight these foreigners, these really non-Greek people. And then his reasoning is this: since we can expect to have future dealings with our fellow Greeks, like having a fight in your extended family where you know you're going to have to, after the fight is over, you're still going to have to live with these people, versus the barbarians, the word they invented, the Greeks, to describe those people way out there who aren't even vaguely Greek, don't even speak a decent language or whatever. They can be treated like scum, basically wipe them out. That you don't have to worry about being nice to them or being moderate to them, because you're not going to live with them anymore. Either they're going to wipe you out or you're going to wipe them out. There's not going to be an after to deal with. Whereas if you're fighting someone within your own realm of operations, the people next door to you, maybe you should, exercise some moderation in your fighting with them. This may seem a little short-sighted. Maybe the world was a lot smaller then, but actually it's still true today. Next in line is Aristotle. He offered he was tended to be in much of his philosophy very inspired by nature. What nature does must be something to do with the way it ought to be. So I sum up his view as in nature we trust. Creatures seek to preserve their physical organization, so it is natural that we should too. What is natural must be an indication of what is okay, he seemed to think. Thus, self-defense is justified. Animals do it, so why shouldn't we? This looks like an instance of what much later would be termed by philosophers such as Jean Moore in the 20th century as the naturalistic fallacy. That's the idea that because something is a certain way, it ought to be that way. Aristotle seemed to suggest that was where he got his inspiration about what ought to be. Depends on what was actually happening in the world. But it's been seriously questioned in modern times, if there's any relationship between the way things are and how they ought to be. But the way Aristotle used this, he used it to legitimate the idea of self-defense. It's perfectly natural for people to want to defend their life if they're threatened. Animals do it, so why shouldn't we, basically? Then Cicero comes along in 106. This is still before BCE, 106 BCE roughly. And he introduces an interesting idea, which is, again, still very much with us. He thinks it makes sense to go to war now to forestall having to defend yourself later under worse circumstances. When the calculations are right, never put off to tomorrow what may be prudent to do today. This is only rational. Maybe this is the practical function of going to war for glory. It's called preemptive aggression, is actually proactive defense. You just don't want to survive today. You want to be in a better position to survive tomorrow. What does this mean? It means that if you can imagine some alien group of people, cohort, becoming a future enemy, kill them now, nip the possibility in the bud. Because what might not be a necessity now is right now, a looming necessity could become plain necessity tomorrow. And if you're in a position to do something about it now, proactively, do it now. You may regret not doing it later. So basically, if you suspect you're going to have an enemy, get rid of them now. Don't wait until they actually do something. This is called preemptive war. Okay. But Cicero also, and another thing that shows up in a lot of these thinkers is that on the one hand, they want to defend or excuse war, and then they come back with a little bit of moderation. They want to say, oh yeah, but don't go overboard. So Cicero also said, but cruelty for cruelty's sake is not sustainable. You are endangering your own future peace, not wise. It's also not polite or the honorable thing to do. Again, necessity, present here and now necessity maybe is more important than worrying too much about too far into the future. So he kind of hedged a bit there. Okay, now we move into the Christian era, and things change here, interestingly. This is 185, circa 185 or about. Origen, it's Origen, was an early church father, a prelate as I call him, began to, started a tradition with the Christian thinkers and followers, started to contend with the idea of war. How do you make war compatible with Christian teaching? For example, it was in the back of their minds. On the surface, it seems like it's not, but how can you avoid it? Anyway, he suggested this: Christians themselves should not sully their hands with blood, but it's okay to support non-Christians, the Roman authorities, to do it for them. Later, post-Roman Empire, these hands-on folk, the Romans, the soldiers, will come to include secular authorities like kings and princes. They will get a divine right. They'll get derivative divine right from these church fathers. They don't get it themselves. It has to be gotten from the religious authorities. They become these secular authorities become inherit the privilege of being instruments of a divine mandate. The prelates, the church fathers, are the messengers of the mandates which come from on high, and they have to be shielded as much as possible from the moral blowback of war, lest anyone get any ideas of moral grime creeping heavenward. God is good; He doesn't deal in war. So, like a physician in a hospital, he may have to get his hands bloody, but it's really the orderlies who have to clean up the mess afterwards. Let them get their hands dirty as much as possible. Along comes Ambrose, another church father, who makes interesting innovation in this thinking about this. He thinks that nations, corporate bodies, their authorities like governments, states, kings, may engage in violent self-defense, but this is kind of conceptual reversal, not individuals. This is anti-Aristotle. In other words, turning the other cheek and getting slaughtered still applies to you as an individual. For the individual, spiritual salvation outweighs in value physical survival. So in other words, if you're just an ordinary person, don't worry so much about dying because it's your soul that matters. However, nations can, so you shouldn't worry about self-defense, but nations can because they have this divine, because they have to create the conditions that allow for Christianity and Christendom to continue. Therefore, they need to survive. You as an individual, as a physical individual, don't have any particular value to your survival. Doesn't matter that much. Augustine had a lot to say about this, and he, again, back and forth. On the one side, he agreed that war is not ideal, but we don't live in an ideal world. Sometimes violence is needed to create the space for Christian brotherly love. Turning the other cheek is not a reliable path toward this goal, but do try to avoid war when possible, please. Augustine further says, nation states may inherit the divine authorization formerly reserved for the church when it comes to excusing war on heathens. Here he's building on what some of the other church fathers had already said. And more beyond that, he also said, but he was still, this is Augustine, he was still a little bit troubled by the Christian notion of turn the other cheek. How do you make that, how do you excuse that not turning the other cheek and still be a Christian? His solution, make sure you are properly motivated by the Spirit when you kill. It's what's inside that counts. In this way, one may fight peacefully. You're not hurting your enemy's soul, just their body by killing them. And God knows that was always temporary housing for the soul anyway. So it's not so bad to have to kill if you're a Christian, and they're doing it in the right spirit. Also, but in this, he gets even further picking up on Ambrose, but it's never okay to kill in personal self-defense. That would be selfish and mean-spirited. Who do you think you are anyway? Defense of a higher cause, yes, of course, but just to save your own skin? Animals do that, and you are above being one of those. You were created in the image of God. So basically, as an individual, again, you're not allowed to defend yourself, but as an individual working for a higher cause, yes. Next is in the 600s, the 7th century, the abbot of Iona. This guy is far less, the next group is far less well known, but they actually did contribute something interesting to the just war theory tradition. Was the abbot of Iona, or Adomnan. He was a progressive Scottish abbot who was first to militate for something called a law of innocence, which gives women and special immunities from war victimization. Quote, because it is a great sin when someone kills the mother and sister of the mother of Christ, close quote. Killing boys, not so much. They tend to be combatants. Anyway, he also said something else that prefigures something about corporate liability. He says, where masses of combatants violate such rules as on the battlefield, like behave brutally and animalistically, and if you're among them, be careful about the company you keep when doing bad things in war. You, though personally innocent, may be justly executed and or maimed for good reasons, for good measure, if your associates are wanton and unscrupulous in their treatment or killing of the enemy. It's not too hard to imagine the kind of semantic creep from this idea to the idea that nobody in the enemy state is immune from being a target because they are associated with their irresponsible leaders and defenders. You have a positive duty to dissociate yourself in every way possible from your compatriots and the powers that act in your stead if they start to show off their depravity. That is, conscientiously object, protest, even become a traitor if in fact the other side is more moral than your side is. This is your moral duty, not a political one for sure, meaning you'll probably pay a steep price for this, but that's what you ought to do. And this idea actually has echoes in Jeff McMahan, who's a living philosopher who argues something a little softer than this, but definitely makes reference to this, that as individuals, people have a moral duty to do whatever it takes to dissociate themselves from immoral activity of their own state or everybody around them. That is in fact what they believe to be the case, that there's a lot of immoral depravity going on around you. Okay, second, the 12th century, now Gratian is a second quarter of the 12th century prelate who prohibited, thought that the church prelates, church fathers, are still prohibited from directly ordering bloodshed, but indirectly they have every duty to do so when dealing with heathens. Okay, now we're beginning to see the build up to the Crusades and the justification for the Crusades. Stephen of Tournai, another obscure person from that same era, offers an interesting, rather innovative suggestion that there can actually be justice on both sides of a war. Injustice, of course, too. This is an amazing insight that did not go over very well then, nor is support for it much in evidence today among those who prosecute wars. Them over there, those yonder, they're evil. We aren't. Henry of Segusio, another obscure guy from that period, distinguishes between what he calls a Roman war, where one where just about anything goes. This reminds me of Plato again, which contrasts with more run-of-the-mill internecine war, where some moral decorum ought to be upheld. In other words, a distinction between those people that are near you, either culturally, and versus those people way over there who have a different religion, language, and so forth on the other side of the world. There's a double standard here, which echoes Plato, actually. Okay, now the stage is set for the Crusades, a holy war to retake real estate. And I quote from Rory, I forget his last name, to reestablish Christendom's rightful possession of the patrimony of Christ and to provide protection for persecuted Christian communities. It was a defensive war, no matter what was being attacked, and no matter that what was being attacked and defended lay far, far away, because no distance in space or time or history is too great for the possessive imagination. The Crusades are not over. Antarctica is carved up. Mars will be soon. God help them if we encounter extraterrestrials weaker than us. God intended the universe for us. It's ours for the taking. It's all ours. Any force standing in the way of our entitlement is an attack on us. We are always justified to defend that entitlement. Thus, all war can be construed as defensive. This implies, like, if you accept the train of thought here, there's no such thing as an offensive war. When you fight, you can attack somebody and it's still defensive if you're attacking some future interest of yours. Okay, now we're past all that church period. Now we're getting into the Enlightenment or the secular period. Now it's mass violence legitimization is fallen into secular, liberal, democratic foreign policy with a vengeance. Democratically elected authorities now have arrogated moral authority on war matters from nature, God, the church, and autocrats and oligarchs of all stripes. Basically, magically, and I use this word magically because Jeff McMahan uses it, groups of people, collectives, cohorts, assert powers of moral discrimination that individuals may not. And you don't need divine intervention anymore. Before Augustine, it had been already settled that just war waging required perceived urgency or necessity and legitimate authority and being thoroughly sold on the goodness of one's intention, that is to say, self-justifying casuistry argumentation. Augustine systematized these themes and questions about them, and Aquinas, taking matters from there, would raise the casuistry even to new heights. Okay, moving forward a few centuries to modern secular thinkers. They begun to they picked up where Aquinas left off. In the 70s, Michael Walzer was famous for his book on just and unjust wars, where he kind of revived Aquinas, this whole idea of just war again, but applying it to modern situations, trying to have it make sense without needing to invoke God or anything, but that it wasn't secular. The idea was that just cause, necessity, legitimate authority, discrimination, proportionality, all judged, of course, by the party seeking justification, never the other side, was what just war theory was about. There's always a just side in a war, and coincidentally, you are always on it. Okay, now finally we get to people who are alive right now. Lately, thinkers on just war have begun to deconstruct the very idea, wondering whether or not some magic is involved. Jeff McMahan, formerly I think it was at Rutgers and then Oxford, suggests that the idea that groups may do what individuals may not, morally speaking, is suspicious. And Helen Frowe extends the thought to the conclusion that if war is justified, then what is done in war is justified too, no matter what it is, as well. This throws the burden back on asking the basic question about whether war is ever justified. And okay, this is a good place to stop before we dig into these in greater detail. But for now, okay, it's being all right. Okay, so anybody have any comments? I think Paul and user. Okay. Anybody want to comment or?
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
So you can rename it to Sam if you want. I can do that. But one question I had was that thing that Plato said supposedly, or was it Aristotle? I forget. But that basically war between people who you may have to have future dealings with ought to be conducted in a different way than wars with, like, quote unquote outsiders whom you can just carry out whatever atrocity you want, and that's not a problem usually. But in reality, I think when we have pretty good empirical record for this, 160 years after the end of the American Civil War and many others, that civil wars actually tend to be far more brutal than wars against outsiders. Not always by any means, but nonetheless, the, as it were, reconciliation process after internecine wars is usually far more fraught, and as opposed to wars against people who you don't have very many dealings with. Oftentimes, just the rulers can shake a hand and the conflict can be ended. It could be argued that the US-Japan conflict ended so cleanly, partly because there really wasn't any real grounds for the people to hate each other's guts, which may be different across people across the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
So that's one comment. And I dare say, I'm sorry to say, from what little I've looked at the literature of on just war. Most of the examples are oftentimes so widely divorced from reality. Michael Walzer, whose name has been mentioned, I mean, his examples are so, I don't even know what word to use. They're just chatty. I mean, they're just like, I mean, it doesn't make head or tail. And I'm honestly, my faith in the integrity of the American Academy was shaken by, the kind of encomiums I heard about this guy, that he revived just war, or he's some sort of great thinker. I mean, I really can't make, many others have talked about this. I really don't know what to say about it. It's some sophisticated form of propaganda, or God knows what it is. But yeah, in terms of argumentation, it's really atrocious. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. About the difference that the distinction between fighting people that are closer to you or culture closer to you, like Europeans fighting Europeans versus Europeans fighting people from the Middle East or from other parts, Asia, or even indigenous peoples in the American continent. Yeah, well, first of all, your comment was that in civil war, where people are fighting people that they're often know very well, as in the American Civil War, which was one of the bloodiest wars the U.S. has ever been in terms of the amount of blood spilled. Well, first of all, Plato and some of the ones who repeated what he said later weren't saying that that's how it actually works out. They were saying that's how it ought to. They were recommending that we show moderation when you have to fight people that are part of your extended family, so to speak, geographically or culturally. Not that that's actually what happens. It could be that some of the most horrible fights are like family feuds between people you know very well, or in that where things can be worse than when you're fighting a complete stranger. So as far as Plato's concerned, I think that he was recommending this, that people, from a prudential perspective, that it's a good idea not to go overboard in killing the people that are your neighbors, for example. You may have to pay a price for this later. But as far as what really happens, I think you may be right that those kinds of wars may be the worst kinds there are. Mike and Jack, I see two hands. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, it's just kind of a brief comment. When you were talking about the issue of being civilized in war versus the barbarians, and it seems like, like in the Napoleonic era, they get so dressed up, that it looks like an attempt to be civilized partly by their dress. They're wearing those elaborate hats, and I often wondered why do you get so dressed up for a war? But I guess that that's the way they did it in those days. But
Yeah,
I mean, it just seems like, there's listening to you describe all of these different justifications, and it just seems like varying degrees of madness. Not you, but the justifications.
well, maybe me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy. It almost like because people usually just do what they want to do, and then later on, they come up with a justification. So it looks like what we're seeing is a lot of the later on justification. But I mean, I think there is sometimes justification. But
Okay,
that's my comment.
okay, thanks, Mike. Well, but you asked an interesting question. I mean, this is not really part of it, but maybe somebody else has an opinion.
We have another question under Mike. It's still Mike, I guess.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mike.
I was just wondering, about the word justification, right? Because how do you measure the justifiedness of a war? Like, say, the more recent ones, right, with Afghanistan, maybe you could say it was understandable that a nation, once attacked and caused great harm to it, would then respond with violence. But was it justified to be there for 20 years and then the result of that is the Taliban returns? Is that justified? Or is only the first part justified? But does it feel like the rest of the 20 years is necessary, given the way that wars are conducted, and therefore the first part cannot be justified? Or is, how do you determine justification? Is it the whole event or is the initiation of it? I think that's something that I keep on running into with this argument that really kind of clouds people's notions of it.
It might be initially justified and then stops being justified.
Yeah, yeah, well, thanks, Jack. Well, you know, the just war theory these are ideas by philosophers. Who knows if any actual historical war ever has been fully justified? And I think they were well, at least the just war tradition, which is being questioned quite seriously right now by contemporary philosophers, but the tradition did last for a long time, over 1,000 years. And my personal feeling is that no, it's most of the wars that I'm aware of are justified. And morally just they're easily explainable. We know that people, when attacked, if they feel threatened, they're going to lash back. But animals do that. That doesn't require any justification or telling yourself a story about how you're right and the other guy is wrong. You're just doing what comes naturally to you. In fact, some of the early philosophers pretty much said that. But there's something else going on when people want to justify a war in addition to just explain it, why it happened, which we'll get to or try to get to later on. But thanks for the point. I agree with you, Jack. I don't think I have a hard time even thinking of one war in history that was fully justified, let alone, most of them.
But can I just say that this is the problem with philosophy? Yeah, oh, sorry.
It's okay, go ahead.
No.
You go ahead.
So this is the problem with philosophy. So if you go to the National War Colleges in the United States, they use some of the books that have been written for just and unjust war.
Yeah.
And wars are failures in general. They're failures from many different points of view. However, in the framework of just war theory as it has evolved, it is a tool of nation states in order to be able to kind of propagandize war and for its citizenry. But I think in general, nobody's ever happy with war. And, in some instances, if war has a strategic objective that we might believe in, often we cannot achieve the strategic objective. So, for example, if you look at the killing of 6 million Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, in a very systematic way, one might question whether that was even a strategic or tactical objective of the war to prevent that or to intervene in it, because we entered way too late to do anything about it from the United States perspective. So I think, so anyway, I just offer that in response, because I think it is a tool. Just war theory is a tool, and it is part of what I did some reading before I came, and it is being expanded. So, for example, the imposition of economic sanctions imposes a kind of economic war on innocent people. That certainly would be in contradiction to just war theory, but would be
Yeah.
there you go.
Can we take one more from here, Victor, and then go back?
Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think there's also a difference between the theory or the idea of going to war and then what actually happens in reality, who's on the ground and
Yeah.
dying. So you can go in after 9/11 and you can attack Afghanistan and think your intention is to do one thing, but then, first of all, I think it took us 10 years to find bin Laden, right? And then after that, we realized we had a huge political mess in Afghanistan. We pushed the Taliban out, but then it's well, then who's gonna govern Afghanistan? And helping the Afghan people govern themselves was just a huge logistical failure and just a huge mess. And at some point at home, the Afghan war became so unpopular that Biden just pulled the troops out kind of in a not very
Trump did,
Yeah.
right, and follow.
right. So I guess my point is I think humans can be irrational and a bit things get messy and there's a lot of unknown variables and a lot of things that aren't planned. And even if we think we have a justification for going to war or initiating something. We don't always think through the ramifications from every single possible angle, what could happen,
Mhm.
and try to like plan those or how.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. What was your name again?
Oh, I'm Amanda.
Okay, hi. Yeah, thanks to you and to Mary. Yeah, Mary, you're right. I think that the just war and somebody else, I think the other guy said, who was wondering about why Michael Walzer was such a big thing back in the 70s, and for his book on just and unjust wars, which was by some considered a classic of the topic and a modern classic. But I think, yeah, it has a lot to do with what the stories, governments and people in positions who want to fight a war have to tell themselves and other people to make it look like what they're doing makes sense. Yeah, it's not real justification in my view. It's window dressing, basically. Even in cases where, I mean, where it does seem like you know, a country brutally attacks another or tries to destroy another with no obvious, but the problem is that his history, people have blinders on when they look at history. Every war has a history that goes way back before the war started, so that you can easily blame or defend almost any action that any government does because of some past event. So if you say, well, say Russia or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, is totally unjustified, but there is a history behind why Russia did that. We may not agree with it or be sympathetic to the Ukrainians or the reverse, but there's always a history behind why people do things. And yes, there are evil people. I'm thinking of well, let's take the classic example of Hitler. What Nazi Germany did wasn't single-handedly done by Hitler. He took advantage of a very bad situation and became the you know the spearhead of a deep wound that the German people had experienced since the First World War. And things were really, Germany was treated pretty badly after the First World War, and even the people in the West, some of them would agree with that. And this is no justification of what he did or what the German people did, but it is an explanation if you're looking for explanations. But anyway, I want to let some other people talk. See, Stephen, and I think Stephen is next. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'd like history a bit and explore the issue, and this issue of turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
When I look for all those periods of history, that it seems to be a common theme, and slapping somebody on the cheek was a challenge to a duel. Now, if you refuse, you're regarded as a coward. Even, you know, ancient Hebrew society at the time of Christ, so probably a lot rougher than what us moderns are. We probably wouldn't last 5 minutes walking down the street of Jerusalem or something like that.
Yeah.
And if you were seen as a coward and a weakling, everybody's going to pick on you. But there was an aspect to the custom, and this is in other cultures as well, that somebody slaps you on the face, you offer them the other cheek, and that's their choice to slap you a second time, then the duel's on. If you refuse, then you're a coward. But in many cultures, you were offered the position that, well, I don't think having a fight with somebody is really a good idea. So you could just turn the cheek and say, well, are you sure about that? That's what you're really saying. So what Jesus could have been saying, in my estimation, is if somebody wounds you, maybe it's an accident. Maybe they haven't really thought about things. Maybe try to work it out, you know, in a civilized manner. Give somebody else the benefit of the doubt. And as Jesus would say, if that doesn't work, kill the bugger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, maybe that makes more sense, but I don't think that's what I hear as being the original Christian view. But thanks. There's a bunch of people here, so I forget who's next, who had their hand up, you know, let's see, GC, I don't think you've spoken. Go ahead. GC, are you there?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi there, I'm here. I just wanted to speak a little bit about the justification part, because I think nowadays, and I wanted to touch, I kind of wanted to speak to the piece about Afghanistan. I think nowadays what we see is just war theory has evolved into different treaty obligations, and also the culmination of morality in law under customary law as well has changed the justification piece, whether you agree with it or not, or how different countries justify it, but threats to peace and security, which is like kind of embedded into the United Nations Charter. So we see the culmination of a just war being a threat to peace and security. And when we see nation states, we see them justifying their own existence as being a reason good enough to justify. And so, you know, that's kind of where we've come. And, you know, all the principles that you were talking about when it comes to just cause, necessity, authority, proportionality, and distinction, those are now embedded in customary law and under the Geneva Conventions. And people have kind of gotten together and agreed that, you know what, at a minimum, you've got to have a way of doing this, and superfluous suffering, or sorry, unnecessary suffering and superfluous injuries are things that we shouldn't allow. So we've seen an evolution in that, but it's still based on the concept that the state is the body. Human rights is the tension that states have when we still fight for the rights of individual, whether it's self-defense or the right to life and stuff like that. So I bring it back to the Treaty of Westphalia, when we got the, you know, the crystallizing of the concept of sovereignty, and the protection of that kind of starts to obscure just war. It protects the nation state, but what it also does is it starts to embed different moral and ethical things in law. Those are my comments. And as far as Afghanistan goes, the war didn't necessarily go on for a long period of time. There's 3 legal ways to get into a country. One is with the consent of the nation, one is with a Security Council resolution, and one is self-defense. And a lot of people don't realize that in Afghanistan, all 3 were happening at the same time. So you didn't have one group of people doing one thing. So Operation Enduring Freedom, for example, for the United States might have come in the guise of self-defense, but then there were other things going on. So when you see a protracted period of time of troops being in a foreign country, it wasn't necessarily for fighting, but more for nation building. And I think that's where the failure came in Afghanistan. Wasn't that we didn't finish a war, is that we didn't stay long enough to help them get back up on their feet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, GC. Let's see, Colin, User, and Jack, both of you have your names up there, and I don't know who was next. Go ahead, Jack.
I think I was next in line.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've got just 2 thoughts about that was prompted by the discussion about the 5 different aspects or requirements for a war to be just. Should I just share one at a time, or both?
Go ahead. Either.
I guess starting about the proportionality requirement, some of the skepticism about, or like challenge to this requirement, was centered around the idea that, like, well, you know, as soon as you get into a fight for your life, like, doesn't proportionality just go out the window, because you're going to do whatever you can, you know, in sort of desperation. And I think that pushback is sort of confusing different sort of like scopes or like levels of zooming in, so to speak. So I think it's confusing, like, what might happen in a battle with what ought to happen on the level of the war, right? So you know, the soldier on the field who's experiencing the trauma of being in an actual battle, you know, their behavior is going to be somewhat unpredictable because of those like animalistic instincts. But the behavior of whoever's calling the shots, like the general, or perhaps the political leaders who are in charge of the military, or whoever's the person who's setting the war goals, or maybe a group of people, those are the folks to whom the proportionality requirement, I believe, applies. Because like as a single soldier, even if you're acting disproportionately in a particular battle, there's only so much damage you can do, you know, unless you're an ICBM technician or something, I guess. So I think for a war to be just, that requirement has to be at the level of the leadership, the people
Yeah.
who are sort of like setting the goals and conducting the war.
Jack, you have another point to make, or was that it?
Yeah, the other one was just about
Jack, could I, before you go with the second one?
Sure, yeah.
To that one. I think the proportionality requirement is being addressed to the people who are running the show, not the soldier on the battlefield. And the suggestion often is that those people in charge who are deciding the wars are the ones who are being addressed here, and they're not behaving proportionally much of the time. I mean, some would say that's happening right now in the Gaza Strip. But you can even more famous example is the U.S. decision to drop bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The history on that now is pretty clear. When I was in school, they were telling us the reason was, of course, because it would reduce the number of people who would be killed if we didn't stop this war sooner. We know now that it had very little to do with that. It had to do with sending a shot across the bow to the Soviet Union. It was a strategic choice. They chose to kill a lot of innocent people to basically create to scare a third party who hadn't yet threatened the United States or the Allied powers. The proportionality, there were my understanding is there were about 150 soldiers, combatants in those cities, and 200,000 civilians who were killed. That's extremely disproportionate. And these were decisions made at the highest levels, not by soldiers on the battlefield. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted to comment on that. Go ahead on your second.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement that those things would be unjust actions, at least because they failed before the proportionality test. Unjust actions even within a just war, perhaps, if the World War II is just. My other comment was about just cause. So the question is, well, who decides whether the cause is just, right? And I'm surprised at how, like, thinking, like, just having some self-awareness here, I'm surprised at how, like, subjectivist this sounds coming from me. But ultimately, it has to be, like, me, right? Whoever's the one who's making the determination about whether the war is just or unjust, that's the person who's making the determination about whether the cause is just or not. So, of course, the leadership who's pushing for war is going to say, of course, this war is just, and they're going to try to sell that idea. Each individual prospective soldier has to make that determination for themselves, whether they're going to join the effort or resist the effort. Each historian looking back has to make the determination for themselves, like, was that war just or not? Like, why? So, one question is the justness of a war something that's sort of like out there in the world to discover? Seems like it isn't. So it's up to each of us to make that determination for ourselves, whether the cause seems just enough. And it seems like the process by which we make that determination, like the quality of that process, is really key.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I really appreciate your comments. Who else is, I think, Mike and call-in user, the ones
Oh,
I
I think Colin,
Yeah, hold on a second. Is there any system for, bringing people aboard to make their comments? Because both times I've raised my hands, I've had to wait like 15 to 20 minutes. And that's really, not something which most of us can do. We are not just sitting at a table like, the organizer can just,
Okay, we'll go
wait
ahead.
like we're in a seminar room.
Yeah.
I would appreciate if there is a system set up, otherwise you're setting up expectations that you can't fulfill.
Well, this is kind of,
So
Well, go ahead and talk. Go ahead.
yeah, well, one thing which was mentioned that the just war theory has been around for 1,000 years, and yeah, I mean, like on paper it may have been around for however long, but it could even be traced to ancient, Greek history and whatnot. But my understanding is basically in Europe it went into severe decline after things like wars of religion, and it was basically not taken seriously. Even more so after the world wars of the first half of 20th century. And really it was, with somebody like Walzer and some academics in North America, writing some papers and whatnot, that, supposedly this revival of just war took place. Most people in Europe literally didn't take it seriously. And my understanding is even now, there's very little academic work being done on that in places that have actually undergone real warfare. And one other person whose name doesn't usually come up as a so-called just war theorist, but he is actually taught in all military academies and actually has had enormous influence. And that is von Clausewitz, who wrote some classic works almost a little over 2 centuries ago.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, maybe we are putting too many eggs in the basket of philosophers, academics, smoking their pipe and coming up with ideas, because you really need to have input from people who have actually participated in wars if, this discussion is to actually have any meat on the bones, other than it being, a completely vacuous, abstract, ideas being batted back and forth.
But
And that's why.
If I can interrupt for a moment, we're not actually discussing political science here or international law, for example. There's a whole doctrine of international law about what ought to happen, or nor are we talking about military strategy. All of that's interesting, perhaps. Clausewitz, for example, they're great military strategists out there, but that's not about the question. Just as Mary brought up, the way I'm using the word justice, it is a moral term. It is you're asking about whether it is a certain war is right or wrong to engage in it in the first place, or if it is right, what are you allowed to do and not do once you're in it? And these are not military or strategic questions. That might be relevant to whether or not your country survives or not. That's fine, but that's related to an explanation, but not a justification. Unless you don't believe that there are such things as justifications, and maybe there aren't. But I'm operating on the assumption that there are, because most serious thinkers about it do believe there is such a thing as justification. I guess if you're a hardcore determinist, you would say that free will doesn't exist. So what are we talking about? We're not doing anything. We're just wasting time.
No.
But
I'm not playing.
But this is not about strategy or even what makes sense from a global, international laws position. It's about fundamentally the rightness or wrongness of war, and if anything, what you're allowed to do in it once you're in it. That's why I didn't get into that. It may be another topic, perhaps, but I don't see where it actually.
No, I don't think it is necessarily. I don't think it can be so neatly divided. That's my objection. And just like as was mentioned, well, let's not go down that path. But for example, something that's been in the news the last few years, there's this doctrine of qualified immunity, because of which American police officers basically can, kill anybody, and they're basically protected. It's not a problem. That's something which is controversial, shall we say. But the point being that, you have to look at both sides of the question. You can't just, sit in your armchair and come up with ideas. And if that's all you're going to do, then it's, of very limited value.
Okay. Does somebody else have their hands up briefly? Bill, you had your hand up, or I don't know if you.
I got to have a question or a comment.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, about the criticism of a philosopher in an armchair. One thing that you could do is just sort of being in a war is just watch war footage. there's such a proliferation of it now. It's easy to find. And, you know, you watch some of that, you just sitting there shaking your head. I mean, there's no real justification. Sorry. Or if there is one, it's hard to find it. But as far as you know, this weakest justification for a war I can remember is the Iraq War. And one thing that was interesting to me in the Ukraine War, there was some Americans that fought in the Iraq War that volunteered to go to Ukraine because they felt it was more just, that it was actually justified to fight in Ukraine. So I just thought that was interesting. That
I knew somebody who did that.
the Iraq, you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he came back. It took a long time to rehab.
Hmm.
Yes, he did, but he was wounded, so he came back. And
Wow.
it took him a while to recover from his wounds.
Yeah, it seems like some wars are just like the Spanish Civil War, that caused a global kind of enlistment. I
Yeah.
think that people thought that was justified, but some wars you could just see they just don't hold up under the smell test. The Iraq War.
Okay. Before I move into the next section, I want to let Jack.
Yeah.
Oh, we got another question.
So,
Go ahead.
I was kind of just an open-ended question that I wanted to posit to the group. Do people think there's a difference between like the justification of war and the justification of war crimes, or where do you draw the line between what is a justifiable act in war, you know, versus a war crime?
Yeah, that's one of the big topics, right? I mean,
Yeah, well, assuming you think there is a difference, because some would say that all war is a crime from the get-go. But assuming you think there's ordinary war where you're just killing the other person, and there's on top of that a war crime, which is supposed to be an extra bad version of killing somebody. What exactly? Actually, we are going to get into that because we're going to be talking about killing innocent people. Is that a war crime or not?
but how many? I mean, this is kind of what got Victor and I started a little bit about this topic. Was there was an article I was reading that said that it's legal to kill a certain number of innocent people. How many?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, who's, you know, where do you come up with 10, 20, 30 innocent?
It may have more to do with whether or not you win the war or not. Then it becomes okay for you to kill them.
I mean,
Well, it comes back to the proportion.
Well, proportionality can
but
also
but
have.
still, what is that? I mean,
Well,
what judges the proportion?
Well, I know,
Yeah.
I hear that. I'm just saying, innocent is innocent, I mean, or what is that? Yeah.
Well, that's you under the laws of war, you can kill a certain number of innocent people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I thought was kind of mad because how many innocent people?
Yeah, well, we're going to get into that in just a moment because this is where the stuff hits the fan, because there's going to be some philosophers who would say that there are no such things as innocent people in war, and we'll see in a moment. And there's a logic to it, which we can disagree or not disagree, but I think it's worth discussing. So, Jack, did you have something to say, or did you say it already?
Yeah, I was just wanted to introduce a distinction that I think might be useful here, which I'm getting from J.J. Smart and his treatment of utilitarianism.
Yeah.
At least something in parallel. So there's the notion of like right versus wrong in ethics, and then irrational versus irrational. And just briefly, right versus wrong is like the action is right if, you know, after we understand all the consequences, it turns out to have been the best possible action at the time. But you can't tell that whether it's right or wrong for quite a while because you have to kind of like, you know, let all those consequences play out. So like it's sort of undetermined. And then, so if you're trying to make a judgment about whether a certain action was, you know, reasonable to have taken, you could call it rational, which is given what we knew at the time and what we could expect the effects of our various actions to be, we picked this action as the most likely, what we think is going to be the best. And we would call that rational as in distinction from right, because we don't know what the right action is going to be yet, because we have to wait for all the consequences to kind of play out. And so I wonder if that distinction might be useful here in the sense of like, and I don't know exactly what language to use, but like two different senses of the word just or justified, where there's the one where like it makes sense for them to have, for the leadership to have, you know, lobbied for war at this time or entered into war at this time, given what they knew, given what they could have expected to happen. And then there's the, well, things didn't turn out that way, and it turned out that you know, this was a huge mistake, right? But they couldn't have known that at the time. I wonder if that distinction might be useful to this discussion going forward.
Actually, in one of the write-ups, I think the one by Helen Frowe, there's an article. She does talk about, you know, the difference between justifiable behavior given what you know at a given time versus justified behavior from an omniscient point of view, where if after the history books have been written, long after the active parties are all dead, when all the facts are in, you might have one answer to the question about whether an activity or war or something was justified. But in real time, so to speak, when people are always operating under less than perfect information, there still might be, given what you know at the time, there may be a rational decision to make. Yeah, I mean, the distinction you're making is one that's made in some of those articles. But I do want to move on, though, to, and I do recommend those articles by Helen Frowe and Jeff McMahan, because I do get into the fine details, that the stuff that we're just going to barely touch on the surface here. But if you want to pursue it, I highly recommend some of those references. I want now to move on, and because there's even more controversial stuff to talk about in a minute, about what was suggested here, the idea that there is how many innocent people are you allowed to kill, or are you allowed to kill? Who is innocent? First of all, who is innocent in a war, and who's guilty too? Okay, so I'm going to read the section, and then we'll pause and we can talk about this in a moment. I'm going to read an overall view of the argument, and then I'm going to spell it out in premise by premise, so we can find out, if you don't agree with this, where's the error, the mistake, and so we can talk about it. This is basically an argument against just war theory, saying that it essentially accomplishes nothing except perhaps give some people something to say to each other about, to make themselves look good in history books, although ultimately the history books will undermine whatever you say now, but they should. That's what good historians do. They dig through the rhetoric and try to get down to the truth of what actually happened, but that's all done historically. Okay, here's the argument, or the beginnings of the argument. Assume the first question about going to war, is it ever justified, can be answered affirmatively. Suppose there are some wars out there that you can say this was absolutely justified war. I'm not sure which one that would be, but pick one, imagine one. And you could do this on the analogy that sometimes in individual cases, sometimes there are individual people whose lives are threatened, and you can understand, and more than understand, but if they respond lethally to the person who attacked them, you can say that person was justified because they were, let's take an extreme case where someone is threatening a child, an adult comes along and threatening the life of a child, and an adult comes along and then threatens the person who was threatening the life of that child. I'm looking for the cleanest case of where you can say that is a justification, okay? A justified case. Suppose there is an actual war on the scale of many people that's like that. That's a truly innocent party, if you can ever find such a thing. Suppose that's true. You are justified in defending your life, or your country is justified in defending its way of life against an aggressor who seeks to destroy it, with the usual caveats centering on not having forfeited your right to live. There is a part I'm skipping here, but I should maybe mention it, and that's this. Modern just war theory doesn't make reference to God or to or to a given authority figure, basically says it's usually couched in terms of rights. And a human right, a basic human being has a right not to be killed. That's like the premise number one of any modern just war argument. And so if you're going to defeat this right, you better have a very good reason, one that it overpowers that right. So, suppose though you do have that. Are there limits to what you can do to your enemy to stop them? Okay. It's a question. Either there are no such limits, you are justified in destroying your enemies utterly, adopt a scorched earth policy, wipe them off the face of the earth. We're talking about a case where it's clean a case as you can imagine of some evil enemy. Or there are things you should not do under any circumstances, such as target non-combatant citizens or inhabitants of your enemy's state, including mothers, children, the elderly, the ill, or anyone who does not pose or can't pose a real threat to you, an immediate threat to you. This second policy, and most just war theories sort of incorporate this idea, or they try to, it may be supposed is motivated by humane impulses that want to label these non-combatants as at least relatively innocent, in quotation marks. But the question is, are they innocent? Precisely what are you doing when you spare non-combatants, besides showing off your alleged humanity? Labeling someone innocent to justify your sparing them makes you look moral, but since those you do target have relationships with these non-combatants, since those you do target are defending supposedly the lives and ways of life of these non-combatants, how can the latter, the non-combatants, be any more innocent than the former, the combatants, those who are putting their lives on the line for the ones they care about? Put another way, if your combatants fighting to defend your life or your way of life succeed, don't you benefit from their success? Is it true that you are innocent while they are guilty for defending you in the eyes of your enemy? How is that possible? Why aren't your defenders innocent too? If defenders are innocent because those they defend are innocent, then combatants and non-combatants alike are equally innocent or guilty, if anybody on either side of war ever is. Okay, if you or your way of life survives today, it is because your combatants, past or present, preserved it for you. You exist because they succeeded. If they hadn't, the descendants of their victims would be where you are now. Isn't that how natural selection works? If your combatants were not innocent as much as you are, then you and they are equally guilty. They for doing your dirty work for you, and you for benefiting from and celebrating, or at least tolerating their having done this. So here's the thing spelled out in point form. And if there's an error here, well, this is what we're going to talk about. This is the argument against just war theory spelled out. Premise one, either war is sometimes or never justified. If never, we don't have to go any further with discussing this. It's never acceptable to kill anybody in a war. If sometimes, and this is what just war theory does claim, that sometimes it is okay to get in a war, then when? For just war theory claims that when certain conditions are met, when defending innocent lives or ways of life against unjustified aggression, it is morally acceptable, even obligatory, to go to war, careful to avoid, of course, not killing bystanders, non-combatants, or killing or holding the killing, and of course holding the killing within proportionate limits. Under these conditions, the active aggressors, the aggressing combatants, the soldiers fighting against on the bad side, so to speak, may be targeted for destruction, but not non-combatants on their side, children, the sick, the elderly, their caretakers, and on that aggressing side. But on the assumption that combatants are defending non-combatants and that the latter are excused from being targeted in just war because they are relatively innocent, how can we rationally target the combatants defending them, those who defend, quote, innocence? Either non-combatants are not innocent or their defenders are equally innocent. We should treat combatants and non-combatants alike. That's a very hardcore principle of justice, that you don't treat things that are the same differently. If they're alike, you treat them alike. Kill them. So either you have to make a decision. Either you treat the combatants, you must treat the combatants and the non-combatants on the opposing side alike. Either don't kill any of them or kill them all. But there's no, the incoherence is this: in just war theory, one seems to want to have it both ways. You want to kill some of them, but you don't want to kill all of them on arbitrary grounds. This is incoherent. That's the argument. Now, I'm going to pause here, and of course, people could come back and say, but there are degrees of innocence or degrees of guilt. Yeah, let's talk about that. Explain that. Anyway, okay, so call in user and then Jack. Okay, go ahead and call in user. You have a comment? Are you there still? Okay, Jack, go ahead. You still have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick question, and maybe I'm just being slow right now, but so for a war to be just, it has to be a defensive war, right? And so if you're fighting a defensive war, then the enemy combatants that you're fighting against are the ones who are in your territory. So when would your combatants come into contact with the enemy non-combatants? Because you're not invading their territory, you're defending yours.
Well, usually, let's say, well, let's take an example. Hamas, what's going on right now in the Gaza Strip. The Israelis are attacking the Gaza Strip. They're killing non-combatants. They're also killing combatants. One could say, the problem is this, that it's the logic that we're trying to get at here. Either if it's okay to kill the combatants because these people are fighting on the unjust, let's assume they are fighting on the unjust side of a war, then you could say, well, you can kill them because they're on the unjust side. But they're fighting, they will say, and most people will say, to protect the interest of the people back home, their families, the innocent people in their community. So if it's okay to kill the combatants on the unjust side, it's also okay to kill the non-combatants on the unjust side, because if one side is guilty and they're defending the others, aren't they also guilty or innocent? It doesn't actually matter which way you go. The point is they're on whatever guilt or innocence one side has, the combatants on one side have also accrues to their non-combatants, their civilians, their people on their side as well. So if it's okay to kill any of them, it's okay to kill all of them. Or if it's not okay to kill any of them, then it's not okay. It's not okay to kill the innocent civilians, and it's not okay to kill the soldiers defending them either. This is the dilemma that Helen Frowe and Jeff McMahan are posing to just war theory. Now, of course, it does happen in every war that all this killing of innocents and combatants alike happens, but we're not talking about real war. We're talking about the justifications people have for going to war. How do you make that make sense? That you can kill a soldier who's defending an unjust cause. Let's assume they're on the unjust side of a war, but it's not okay to kill the civilians on the unjust side. It is okay, Helen Frowe is saying, to kill the unjust civilians. Why? Because they're on the same side. They're supporting the people fighting for them or fighting for them. Anyway, that's Daniel K. and Elizabeth. I forget who was there first.
Hi, it's an interesting problem. I came a little late, but just on the last point there's 2 points I want to make. On the last point that Jack made, you can be on the defensive and still be in the other person's territory. So today wars are cross-border. So
but I'm not sure what territory you're on makes any difference here.
Yeah, that's my point. That's my point. It's a war. It's could be global almost. But what I want to ask is a second question based on your thesis that you just presented. Let's say if in a situation where you know that the majority of the non-combatants are opposed to the war. Let's say like in Russia, that's a distinct possibility.
Yeah.
In Gaza, it's a distinct possibility. So the non-combatants are opposed to the war, but they're not willingly participating. So that theory falls apart in that situation, that you should make every effort to avoid harming non-combatants.
Yeah, well, good point. One of the things that Helen Frowe says, also, one could argue there are degrees of guilt, but think of, let's take the United States or a country, the taxpayers and the voters in this country. Let's suppose they were engaged in a war that was unjust in the eyes of some party that could really judge that. Then the taxpayers and voters are complicit simply by being tax voters and citizens of that country. You could refuse to pay your taxes because they go to pay for to supply the wars, to fund these wars. You might suffer consequences for that. You could also leave the country, as many people did during the Vietnam War, in protest. You may have to make sacrifices. You may even have to go to jail, depending on the country. You may even forfeit your life. You may even be treated as a traitor or but these are prices you pay, according to people like Frowe and McMahan, for being moral. You're basically standing up for what you believe is the correct position as an individual citizen of these countries, and you may have to pay a price, he thinks, for that, but that's what morality requires. He thinks we all have a duty to judge what our governments do as individuals, and we need to take action against immorality on the part of governments, even though we're very powerless compared to them. But whatever it takes, that's what we're morally obligated to do.
That's a very strict criteria, because let's take Russia, for example. If you think it's if you're a citizen there, you think it's an unjust war.
Yeah.
Would you expect 150 million Russians to vacate or leave the country or topple the regime? I mean, that's really what you're demanding, and that presents all kinds of other issues as well.
Right. Well, he agrees. This is a hard line to take, but he thinks that people can do, short of allowing themselves to go to prison or something, or executed or exiled, they can still, within the realm of what's possible for them, express their extreme displeasure with what their government is doing, if it is in fact doing something that in their judgment is immoral. And this could be something small as just speaking out. It doesn't have to be that you're going to join the enemy or anything, though it could. He wants to create a moral space. He calls it the deep morality of war, which as a moral reductionist, he believes that in the end, right or wrong comes down to individuals. By the way, this is what earlier when I was talking about the history, we talked about the magic. He called it there's a kind of magical thing going on when states or governments or entities that have the power to make things happen can dictate morality to us. He doesn't think that is ever the case. Certainly governments have the right to create laws, but laws are not inherently moral. They are what a given power center has decided to promulgate. There's nothing inherently moral about a law that's passed by a government. Morality is always down to an individual person, what your conscience allows you to do. What governments do is what governments do. They do it because they have the power to do it. You may suffer consequences if you disagree with them, but the morally right thing to do is to oppose your own side if it's engaged in something that you feel is morally wrong. This is sometimes, this basically is making a sharp distinction between the law as embodied in power concentrations like governments on the one hand, and morality, which is always individual. It's about what you can or can't do, or what you feel you must do or not do. So this is I think both Helen Frowe and Jeff McMahan are sometimes labeled as reduction, as moral, what's it called? Reductive something or other. I forget what it is. They take morality to be always an individual thing. And what governments do is amoral. It may or may not serve some moral purposes, but it's like they're like forces of nature. Tornadoes or hurricanes are not evil, or not. They can create evil, but they aren't themselves responsible. It's ultimately the individuals who compose a society that can be morally responsible, and they can only do what they can do. But he thinks that if collectively they could do something to oppose immoral behavior on the part of their governments. And that's basically what their position is. And this is why they put the burden on basically the question, because this idea that innocent people can be slaughtered, what they're trying to do is it's the right word, they're creating a reductio ad absurdum. They're forcing you to say, look, if you're going to kill soldiers, then you think that's right to kill them, they're enemy soldiers, then it's also right to kill the enemy civilians for the very same reason, because they're benefiting from whatever these soldiers are doing. Now, you mentioned what if there were innocent parties in a government who don't approve of the war you're in, and is it okay to kill them? No, it's not okay to kill them. It's not okay to kill their soldiers either, though. That's the point. It's not that it's okay to kill the civilians, it's that it's not okay to kill the soldiers either, for the very same reason. Now, I can imagine sometimes there are soldiers, there are people who join the military because they have a deep sadistic interest in killing people. If that's why they're in the military, then maybe they would be proper targets of being, they should be killed because they're in it for the killing. That isn't the case, though, with most soldiers. Most of them believe, wrongly or rightly, that they're defending something important to them. So in that sense, they're just as innocent as the people that they're defending. And that's the claim that's being made by these two people. Anyway, I'm sorry. Elizabeth, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point to Daniel. So about if you're not being represented in the war, why should you be killed as collateral damage? But if you say you reduce it to a war with 4 people, where 2 are the fighters and there's another 2 on each side, so you've got 2 pairs where one is acting on behalf of the other. If there's fully informed consent between those 4, that in a war between the 2 representing those 2, I'll take my chances as the one not fighting, and I'm happy for you to fight on my behalf, then I think anything goes, and it's totally fair enough, whoever's killed. But in a situation where people haven't given their informed consent about someone going to war on their behalf, then absolutely they should not be a target at all. And the informed consent applies to the actors in the war, because someone who's acting in a war on the ground may not be fully informed about the real reason for why that war's taking place, like the acquisition of oil routes and masquerading as let's fight human rights abuses, etc. So the informed consent applies all the way down the chain, and it's what Trevor said in the comments in the chat. If you're tricked into a belief by the most sophisticated propaganda machine, can you really be complicit? But how much informed consent is realistic when we're in alleged democracies where there's so much censorship and lack of freedom of information?
Right. Thanks, Elizabeth. But the point that Frowe is making is that the average soldier is in exactly the same situation. They're not likely to be more informed than the average civilian about what's really going on. Most soldiers are cannon fodder. They're not well educated. They're propagandized. They're told, maybe they're offered, well, if you go serve your country, you'll be honored afterwards. You'll get career opportunities and so forth. They're not actually paradigms of informed consent, most soldiers, no different than the average civilian. So they're victims too, in a war on a par with the average civilian. There might be an occasional.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There might be an occasional soldier who really is in this for sadistic reasons, and just like there might actually be an innocent, a truly innocent civilian out there who's actually fighting against their country's participation in a war. But these are tragic examples. They might well be killed. But the point is that there is no distinction between the combatant and the non-combatant on this score is what their claim is. Not that innocents should be killed, but most soldiers are on a par with those innocents. That's it. Now one could argue, but they have a gun pointed at you, right? But why are they doing that? Most soldiers, leaving aside the psychopaths or the sadists, they're doing it because they believe wrongly or rightly their side is right. And if that's because they're not ignorant, not educated, because they've been brainwashed and so forth, again, they're victims, just like the civilians on their side. And that's the point, their point they're making. And so that it seems like the distinction that just war theory makes between it's okay to kill the combatants, but it's not okay to kill the non-combatants, falls apart here, because most of the time there is no actual difference between them. If one party's innocent, so is the other. If one party's guilty, so is the other. Not every one of them, but no one goes around asking people, "Are you against the war? If your country's waging against mine, if you are not against that war, I'm going to kill you." I mean, that's just not part of anybody's equation. I mean, understanding, but yeah, thanks. Okay, Jack and call-in user, if you're go ahead, Jack.
Yeah. Just first, I just want to say for a call-in user, when you put your hand up, there was 2 people in line that you weren't able to see because you were calling in on your phone. So that's why the wait's so long. I just wanted to on the topic of like, what does it matter whose territory you're in for the evaluation of justness? I was only bringing that up because real quick, because it's understood that the aggressor is already not fighting a just war, so we don't even have to worry about arguing about it further. The aggressor is unjust, period, right?